Hello there. Welcome to this recording session for The Prestige. So, a little bit of a setup here. If you've watched a recording session before, you'll know how this goes, but if this is your first time watching a recording session for the Based on a True Story podcast, here is what you need to know. First, I'm not really going to be paying attention to the video. I'm paying attention to the audio as I record because the end result of this is going to be an audio podcast. Now, what we're recording today is The Prestige, and The Prestige is obviously not a based on a true story movie. So this is actually a minisode for based on a true story producers. And the difference between that is for a regular episode of based on a true story, we compare history with what happened in the movie. So, Titanic, what actually happened in Titanic, right? That claims to be based on a true story, and we look at the history behind that. The Prestige does not claim to be based on a true story, but there's still some history in there that we can look at and just kind of have some fun with. And that's really all this is overall the podcast is for entertainment, right? But this is really just intended to be something fun and the ability to say thank you to supporters on Patreon who support the show. So the final episode for this will not go live to the public. It will go live to producers for Based on a True Story, which if you want to sign up, you can get access to that at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/support, by the way. But you'll get to see everything here as we get the camera rolling and kind of how this podcast minisode is going to be created. So, first things first, let's name this. This is The Prestige. And I'm going to select copy and then paste this in. So that way my project is also called The Prestige, so I know what I'm working with here. Let's arm my track that I have set up so you can see the audio levels are bouncing. Everything is good to go, and we are ready to record. So, here we go. Let's start this recording. Magicians have put on some incredible shows that have amazed, astounded, and astonished crowds throughout history. We all know magic in the real world isn't anything like what we see in the world of Harry Potter, but magicians create some amazing illusions that there's nothing left to do but just be left in awe at how they are managing to do the things that you just saw. From modern names that you've heard of like Penn and Teller or David Blaine to classic names like Harry Houdini, magic has been something that's attracted throngs of people for centuries. And if you're one of those people who has been captivated by amazing illusions, then you've probably seen the great Christopher Nolan film that puts magicians on the big screen. That's right, it's time to look at the historical aspects from the 2006 movie, The Prestige. All right, so that is the introduction. I'm going to leave a little bit of a break here so that way I know the difference between the introduction and the bulk of the main episode. And then let's keep moving on. Michael Caine's voiceover greets us as the movie kicks off by telling us that magic tricks have three parts. On screen, we see his character, Cutter, perform a bit of magic for a little girl in the form of making a bird disappear. As Cutter explains, the first of those three parts is the pledge. That's when the magician shows you something that looks perfectly normal. Then comes the next part. The turn. What happens during the turn is that the magician makes what seems normal do something not normal. For the example we see on screen, Michael Caine's character makes the bird disappear. But that's not the best part, because the third act comes with the prestige. That's the twist at the end that garners the audience's applause. As he says this, on screen, we see Cutter bring the bird back for the little girl. And with that, we have our first question to answer. Are these the three parts that make up a magic trick? Yeah, they are. And they are exactly what the movie describes, with the prestige typically being the most difficult of the three to perform. Although, I suppose you might say there's another part of the magician's act: never tell a secret. After all, if you know how any of those three parts are done, it's not magic. Heading back to the movie, after the opening sequence, we're introduced to a few more characters. There's Robert Angier, who's played by Hugh Jackman. Then there's Alfred Borden, who's played by Christian Bale. Both Angier and Borden are magicians. Angier's stage name in the movie becomes the Great Danton, while Borden becomes the Professor. Now, before we go any further, let's fact-check these characters. I mean, the characters themselves are fictional, but their stage names certainly sound like something you might hear for a real magician. Except they're not. In the wake of the movie, there's at least one magician who has claimed the name on YouTube. But looking a little closer to the timeline of the movie, probably the closest would have been a man named Georges Danton, who was a leader in the French Revolution. So maybe that's why it's a real-sounding name, but not a magician, nothing really magical there. As for the Professor, that was a real magician. His name wasn't Alfred Borden, of course, but rather... Okay. I'm going to stop here because I have a pronunciation. And just to make sure I get it right. Okay, it's pronounced day. So what I'll do for pronunciations is, because English is my only language, and so if, of course this guy's Canadian, so you'd think with a last name like mine that I would be able to pronounce it. But anyway, if there's a pronunciation, a name, a place, or something like that, then what I'll do is I will actually go and find, if I can, if it's something more recent, news archives or something where somebody is pronouncing the name and get a couple of them in order to figure out how it's pronounced, and then I'll actually write it out phonetically so that way I can do it. Now, there's two things about that. One, a lot of times people pronounce things completely differently, so, for example, a great example, I actually had a listener do this. So there's Newfoundland, right? And it's spelled Newfoundland, right? So it's spelled like Newfoundland, right? But I actually had a listener who is from there and said, the authentic way to pronounce this is Newfoundland, right? Not Newfoundland, but Newfoundland, right? And so I was like, okay, that's great. I mean, you're from there, you should know how it's pronounced. And so I took their word for it, and that's how I pronounce it. And then, of course, I released an episode where I mention it, and somebody reached out and said, no, it's actually pronounced Newfoundland. I'm from there. So anyway, people pronounce things differently. That's the way it goes, and hopefully it doesn't detract from the story. With that said, this one in particular is D-A-I, and I just wanted to make sure it is pronounced day. Based on the research that I did for looking that up, so that's what I'm going to go with. Anyway, that's a little bit of a sidetrack there, but let's keep recording. As for the Professor, that was a real magician. His name wasn't Alfred Borden, of course, but rather it was Dave Vernon. Day, which is short for David, was a Canadian magician who specialized in sleight of hand in the early 20th century before passing in 1992 at the age of 98. In the movie, the relationship between Borden and Angier is a friendly one up until there's a disaster that sees Angier's wife, Julia, get trapped in an underwater trick. She can't escape and dies. Something Angier holds against Borden because he tied the knot around her hands. After this accident, Borden and Angier go their separate ways and become rivals. And that's when Borden, who was an assistant before, takes on the Professor moniker. And that leads us to our next question. Angier and Borden are fictional, but were there rivalries between magicians like what we see on screen? The answer to that is a resounding yes. In fact, there have been many rivalries between magicians. For example, there was the rivalry between a magician in the early 1900s named Ching Ling Fu and an American imposter who pretended to be a Chinese magician named Chung Ling Su. But Su was not Chinese. His real name was William Robinson. Their rivalry continued from around 1904 until 1918 when Su was killed trying to catch a bullet. You can learn more about Sue in the episode called Death by Misadventure on the Illusion Podcast over at illusionpodcast.com. Another famous rivalry in history between magicians was the one between James Randi, who spent decades of his life after being a stage magician to try to debunk other magicians who were claiming that their magic was real. It was something paranormal. One of these men that Randi went after was a man named Uri Geller. Both Randi and Geller are still alive as of this recording, and the rivalry, if you can call it that, is still going on to this day. Maybe not as much as it was a few decades ago, but it's still there. A little more recently, two of the most famous magicians have had their own rivalry. That would be one between David Copperfield and Criss Angel. The rift between these two came mostly from Angel's side, as he made allegations that Copperfield both bought. The rift between these two came mostly from Angel's side, as he made allegations that Copperfield both bought Twitter followers and didn't follow through on donation promises that he'd made for some charities. As for Copperfield's side of the rivalry, I said that wrong. As for Copperfield's side of the rivalry, well, there isn't really one. He hasn't really responded to any of the allegations, so that's where they stay, as allegations. So maybe that's a bit of a one-sided rivalry. Can those exist? But if there's one rivalry that the movie is pulling inspiration from most, it would probably be the rivalry that included the most famous magician of all time. That was around the turn of the century when Harry Houdini was challenged by another magician named Cernach. It was Cernach's claim that he was the original escape artist, not Houdini. Challenges were made, and both sides wanted to gain audience approval. In the end, Houdini was the one that emerged on top as the better escape artist. Speaking of the illusions put on by magicians, if we head back to the movie, the key illusion that takes place is what Borden calls the transported man. He goes up on one side of the stage, and then he walks into a door on the stage. Seconds later, he reappears across the stage, emerging from another door. How does he do it? Well, like any great magician's trick, that's not something I want to spoil, just in case you haven't seen the movie, but it's a huge part of the plot. I'm going to change that. Speaking of the illusions put on by magicians, if we head back to the movie, the key illusion that takes place is what Borden calls the transported man. He goes up on one side of the stage and he walks to a door, goes into the door, and then seconds later reemerges. All right, hold on. Let me take a drink of delicious tea. Speaking of illusions put on by magicians, if we head back to the movie, the key illusion that takes place is what Borden calls the transported man. He goes up on one side of the stage, he walks through... Hold on. There we go. So this is tripping up on the in the script. It's something I've kind of ignored as I've actually recording. You can't see this. So basically on the script, I wrote, he goes up on one side of the stage, he walks into one door, and then re-emerges on through another door. But using the word one that many times, as a copy editor, which I've done for years, I don't like that. And so it kind of trips me up as I'm reading it as well. So I'm going to fix that. Speaking of the illusions put on by magicians, if we head back into the movie, the key illusion that takes place is what Borden calls the transported man. He goes up on one side of the stage, walks into a door on the stage, and then seconds later reemerges across the stage from another door. How does he do it? Well, like any great magician's trick, it's not something I want to spoil just in case you've seen the movie. It is a huge part of the plot after all. But what we can do is ask ourselves this question. Was there ever a magic trick called the transported man? No. In 2017, though, there was an exhibit at Michigan State University named after the trick in The Prestige, the movie. And that exhibit showcases really the three acts of the trick: the pledge, the turn, and the prestige. It's not magic, it's an art exhibit. It really has nothing to do with the transported man other than the fact that it was just named after that trick in the movie because of the popularity of the movie. Now, throughout the movie, we learn how dangerous magic is. People die. And that part of the movie is telling. It's not, is telling. I said that wrong. It's not it's telling, it's telling, it's true. Anyway, you'll understand when I re-record this. Throughout the movie, we learn how dangerous magic is. People die. And that part of what the movie is telling is very true. The magic we see in the movie may not have been real, but that doesn't mean there aren't magicians out there performing some amazing illusions, and it's not always safe. Like we see in the movie, there have been countless magicians who have died during their performances. Another act that might have inspired the filmmakers behind The Prestige could have been the death of Gilbert Ginesta. Not Ginesta, Ginesta. Another act that might have inspired the filmmakers behind The Prestige could have been the death of Gilbert Ginesta. Sort of like Angier's wife in the movie, Gilbert's trick was that he was locked into a barrel of water only to make his escape, to the amazement of the audience. It was a trick he basically stole from Harry Houdini, and he performed it successfully many times. Sadly, in 1930, he didn't make the escape. Although he usually used water, some historians believe it may have been a can of milk that he was locked in for his final performance. Was that somehow the cause? We don't know. One of the most dangerous magic tricks that's been passed down from generation to generation, though, is the bullet catch. We already learned about Chung Ling Su's death by bullet catch, but another famous magician who died during a bullet catch was Madame Delinsky. Not Madame, Madame. We already learned about Chung Ling Su's death by bullet catch, but another famous magician who died during a bullet catch was Madame Delinsky. This was in 1820, and one of her tricks was to catch bullets from 6 people shooting at her at the same time, 6 different people. But in secret, really what she would do is she would pay off the people shooting and then have them load a blank into the gun. She managed to get away with this because back then they used to have to bite off the cartridge and load the bullet in manually, jamming it down with a ramrod. And then to perform the trick, the shooter would simply bite off the entire bullet. The bullet would stay in their mouth, hidden, and then they would actually just put a blank in. So it looked like they were loading it, but they were loading it differently. To this day, though, Delinsky was... Not to this day, just this day. There's one particular day. This day, though, Delinsky was performing for the German royal court. She carefully instructed each of the 6 soldiers who were to shoot at her how they should bite off the bullet and load the blank. As the story goes, one of the soldiers got nervous. Instead of doing what he'd been told to do, he simply loaded the gun the way he always had before. The right way. She died 2 days later from the wound in her abdomen. Her unborn child didn't survive either. Alright, so that's the end of the minisode. Ends on kind of a sad note there for sure. I'm going to put this here. And alright, so let's do the outro here now. Actually, I'm going to stop this real quick. I don't know if you can hear this or not, but I have there's an airplane flying overhead, so I'm going to stop the recording real quick and then pick back up when that's done. And we're back. All right, so let's continue here, and that brings us to an. Oops, I need to hit record. Oh, speaking of which, it looks like I never hit record on my actual computer either. So I'll just edit in here. All right. Great. That's part of the fun of, doing everything yourself, is sometimes there are mistakes, and that's the way it goes. So, all right. So let's you get to see the actual audio part, or the actual screen, just for the ending here. This is the stuff that we've recorded that you missed. You got to see me record it, but not the ending. So let's just watch the ending here. Something brand new. Actually, I need to move this. There we go. All right, and here we go. And that brings us to an end of our mini-sode today. What's your favorite magic trick? I've got to admit, I watched Loving. I mean, Loving was a great movie. If you haven't seen it, go watch it, about Richard and Mildred Loving. Great movie. But that's not what I'm trying to say here. And that brings us to an end of our mini-sode today. What's your favorite magic trick? I've got to admit, I love watching Penn and Tellers fool us on TV, just because it's fun to see some of the amazing illusions that people can perform. It's not real magic, but it still takes an incredible amount of talent, skill, and crazy amounts of practice to get right. Oh, one more story I wanted to tell before I wrap this up, just really quick. The first time I actually saw The Prestige, I bought the wrong tickets by accident. I ended up buying tickets to The Illusionist. That's the movie with Ed Norton and Jessica Biel. It's also about a magician, and it was released about the same time as The Prestige. Maybe that was a bit of a magic trick in and of itself? No, it's just going to the wrong movie. Have you ever done that? Bought a ticket to the wrong film and then... Well, that was the first for me. But in all fairness, how many magician movies are there? And then there's 2 released at the exact same time? Come on, Hollywood. Anyway, I got to see that. And then I actually went back to see The Prestige later on. Okay, enough rambling. Finally, before we wrap up this episode, it's time to learn what we'll be covering on next week's regular episode, and that would be the movie Hidalgo. I've received quite a few requests for this one, and that's what we'll be covering next week on the regular podcast. Until then, thanks so much for your support, and have a great week. And that's it. That is the ending. Stop recording. All right, so thanks for sticking through. Sorry for that technical aspect there where I didn't even hit record on the computer. But, that is kind of part of it, and that's... I'm not going to turn this into anything real too long here at the end, but just that's kind of part of one of the reasons I wanted to show this behind here, because I get a lot of feedback and a lot of stuff where people seem to think that this podcast is created by an entire company, and there are a lot of podcasts that are created by entire companies. This is not one of them. This is an indie podcast that is just created by a total of one person. So it's something where, I will make mistakes, and that happens. But hopefully you enjoy the show, and hopefully you have as much fun listening to it as I have creating it. And if you don't, that's perfectly fine. There's hundreds of thousands of other podcasts out there, hundreds of thousands, even more so, millions of movies and TV shows and tons of entertainment. So I realize it's not for everybody, but that's just the way it goes. All right, so that is the end of this one, and I hope to catch you in the next recording session where we will not be recording Hidalgo, I don't think, because I have not written that one yet as of this particular recording. So I need to write that one out first. That's one of the most time-consuming parts, is writing and researching, because of course that's where you come up with the script, and then it's just actually doing that. So that's really the time-consuming part, all the research and everything that digs into it. I don't remember what the next one is that we'll be recording, but hopefully to see you there. Bye for now.